"Oh, still single? Pathetic for someone your age," he sneered, looking me up and down with that familiar smirk. Standing in the entryway of a high-end Chinese restaurant, I found myself face to face with my ex-husband, Ken. I hadn't seen him in years, yet here he was, still smug, still cruel. I felt a pang of anger rise but managed to keep my face blank. I was here with my parents hoping for a peaceful evening, but now the past was standing in front of me, dredging up old wounds I'd rather keep buried. Suddenly, my sister Michelle appeared beside him, casually taking his arm. My stomach twisted, but I kept my expression calm. Then Ken dropped a bombshell. "We're getting married." The words hung in the air like an insult, but I merely raised an eyebrow, amused. "You didn't tell her, did you?" I asked, watching his face carefully, knowing he was about to experience a twist he'd never see coming. Our tangled past had led us here, and I was about to relish his confusion. Let me rewind for a moment. My name is Marie. I'm 39 years old, and a few years ago, I believed I had finally found true happiness. I had married Ken, a man who worked in transport and who, at first, seemed like the perfect partner. We met at the office where I was an administrative clerk. Ken's energy was captivating, and he had an effortless charm that drew me in. His humor, coupled with his rugged looks, made it easy for me to fall quickly. In fact, it was I who made the first move, and within 6 months, we were married. I thought I knew him. But marriage has a way of revealing things that dating doesn't. Beneath his charm, Ken was something else entirely, a person I never thought I'd end up with. Almost immediately after the wedding, he changed. The once warm, gentle man I fell for turned into a harsh, controlling presence in my life. Looking back, I wish I had seen the signs, but by then I was already trapped. It started small. A sharp comment here, a controlling behavior there. But soon, Ken's temper grew worse, and I found myself tiptoeing around him daily, unsure what might trigger his next outburst. He'd come home from his short delivery shifts angry and irritable, slamming doors and muttering under his breath. I felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells, trying to avoid his wrath. The first time I suggested working myself, hoping it might ease the financial stress, he exploded. "So my income isn't good enough for you?" he yelled, his words dripping with venom as he slammed his drink onto the table. His anger filled the room, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to reassure him, saying I only wanted to help, but he wouldn't listen. "Who do you think you are?" he sneered, making me feel small and worthless. I soon realized that any attempt to stand up for myself would only make things worse. Life with Ken became a daily challenge to avoid conflict, and each day I felt myself shrinking a little more. The longer we were married, the more isolated I felt. My only refuge was visiting Ken's parents, Daniel and Jessica, who had always treated me with kindness and respect. They welcomed me as if I were their own daughter, and their home became my safe space, the one place where I felt I could breathe. But even that was tainted by Ken. During a holiday gathering at his parents' house, Ken humiliated me in front of everyone. One of his cousins had made a lighthearted joke about his own wife's cooking, and before I could even react, Ken chimed in. "You're lucky," he sneered. "My wife's completely lost her shape. She barely even looks like a woman." His words were like knives, cutting deep as everyone else laughed uncomfortably. Only Daniel seemed to understand my embarrassment, and he gently suggested I join Jessica in the kitchen. Once we were alone, I broke down, overwhelmed by shame and sadness. Jessica, bless her, tried to comfort me, but I could feel Ken's words haunting me, a constant reminder of how little he valued me. I realized that even in my safe spaces, Ken had managed to poison my happiness. My life continued like this, a cycle of constant anxiety and disappointment, until my sister Michelle appeared. 3 years older than me, Michelle had always been the confident one. With her captivating looks and charisma, she commanded attention wherever she went. She noticed right away that something was wrong, and one day, she insisted I tell her everything. I hesitated at first, not wanting to burden her with my troubles, but eventually, I broke down and confessed. Michelle was furious, her eyes blazing as I recounted the countless insults, the relentless belittling. She listened silently. Then, after a moment, she leaned in and whispered something that sent a shiver down my spine. "What if I make him want to leave you?" At first, I didn't understand what she meant, but as she explained her plan, a spark of hope ignited within me. She'd use her charm to turn his interest toward her, making him so fixated that he'd demand a divorce. It was risky, but Michelle was confident, and I trusted her completely. Desperate for freedom, I agreed. Michelle began visiting frequently, her magnetic personality quickly catching Ken's attention. I could see the fascination growing in his eyes whenever she was around. She was warm, engaging, everything Ken had always craved. Slowly, he became obsessed with her, barely noticing me anymore. The house that had once felt suffocating now felt like a safe space again, as Ken was too busy focusing on Michelle to direct any anger at me. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of peace. Every evening, Michelle would arrive, and I would quietly retreat to my room, listening to them talk and laugh. It was as though I was invisible, and I was glad for it. Michelle played her role perfectly, never crossing a line but always keeping Ken wanting more. I could see his attachment to her deepen with each passing day, and with it, my hope for freedom grew. Ken had always thought he was in control, but this time, Michelle was the one pulling the strings. Then one evening, Ken came to me with a smug grin on his face. "I want a divorce," he announced, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The word sent a thrill through me, but I kept my expression neutral, feigning shock. He mistook my silence for pain and continued, savoring every moment. "I've found someone who actually makes me happy," he declared, clearly relishing what he thought was a victory over me. He didn't even realize that this was what I wanted, what Michelle and I had planned. He brought a lawyer into the house, smugly suggesting I take a settlement so we could be done quickly. Holding back my relief, I told him I'd agree, but only if he gave me $30,000 and half of our savings. Ken didn't hesitate, signing the papers with the confidence of a man convinced he was getting what he wanted. He had no idea he was simply a pawn in a game we were controlling. My freedom was finally within reach, and the irony of it all brought a small smile to my face. The day of our chance meeting at the restaurant marked the final act of our plan. Ken had no idea we were meeting there on purpose. As I watched him approach, holding Michelle's hand with a smug look, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He was beaming, ready to flaunt his new life with my sister in front of me, completely unaware of what was coming. With a triumphant look, he proudly declared, "Michelle and I are getting married." I waited a moment, letting his confidence linger before I delivered the blow. "What, you didn't tell her?" I asked, watching his smile fade. Michelle pulled her hand away from his, her expression soft but firm. "Ken, I'm sorry, but I was never in love with you," she said quietly. His face went pale, the shock dawning on him slowly. He looked back and forth between us, trying to understand what was happening. His confidence evaporated, replaced by confusion, and slowly, humiliation. Michelle's words left Ken reeling, but we weren't finished yet. Taking a deep breath, I looked him in the eyes and said, "It was all a plan, Ken. Michelle and I set this up." I could see the realization hit him piece by piece. His face flushed red, and he sputtered in disbelief. Both of you deceived me?" he stammered, his voice wavering. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction wash over me. "You thought you were in control, Ken, but you were nothing more than a pawn," Michelle said, her tone cool. His disbelief turned into fury, but before he could say anything, our parents stepped forward. They had been listening the entire time, hidden in a private room just a few steps away. Jessica's eyes were filled with sadness as she looked at her son. "How could you treat Marie this way?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Daniel stepped in too, his expression stern. "You're no son of mine if this is how you act," he said coldly. As Ken tried to argue, my brother-in-law Steve appeared, blocking his way. Steve, who had been in on the plan from the start, was more than ready to put an end to Ken's ranting. Calmly but firmly, he took Ken by the shoulder and led him toward the door. Ken struggled, his face contorted in anger, but he was powerless. The restaurant went silent as Steve escorted him out, ensuring he couldn't make a scene. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy for him, but it quickly faded. I had endured years of his cruelty, and now I was finally free. Ken had lost everything: his wife, his family's respect, and his dignity, all because of his own actions. I watched him disappear out the door, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. The nightmare was over, and I was ready to begin a new chapter. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet assurance that I had taken back control of my life. Over the next few weeks, I heard through mutual friends that Ken had tried to contact Michelle, desperate to rekindle the relationship he thought he had. Each attempt was met with silence, and eventually he realized there was no going back. Steve confronted him once, warning him that if he continued to harass Michelle, he'd have to deal with the consequences. Ken, humiliated and defeated, finally stopped trying. Life returned to normal, and I began to rebuild the pieces of my shattered self. 13 years have passed since that fateful day, and I now work alongside Michelle, managing the finances for her successful shop. The nightmare that was my marriage is a distant memory, a cautionary tale that reminds me of my own strength. I have rebuilt myself from the ground up, supported by the family who truly loves me. Jessica and Daniel continue to treat me as their daughter, and I visit them often, grateful for the kindness they showed me during my darkest days. Looking back, I realized that revenge wasn't the goal. It was about reclaiming my sense of self. Ken had taken so much from me, but with Michelle's help, I found the courage to break free. Our plan had been risky, but it had worked flawlessly. Ken's downfall was orchestrated not out of spite, but out of necessity. I needed to reclaim my life, to be reminded that I deserved respect, love, and peace. Michelle saved me, and for that I am forever grateful. As I stand here today, surrounded by people who genuinely care for me, I know that the past no longer defines me. Ken is just a memory, a chapter in a book that I have long since closed. My life now is filled with laughter, hope, and resilience, a testament to the power of family and the strength that lies within each of us. I have moved on, stronger and wiser, ready to embrace whatever comes next.